Okay, we should be live now. So welcome everybody to Signs and Wonders. I'm pretty happy today we have with us brother James Snapp Jr. And he's going to be talking about the manuscripts, the footnotes, and the authenticity of the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell them what you do, and say hi, and take it away.
Well, hello. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me on the program. And is it called a program or a podcast?
It doesn't matter, man. Whatever you're comfortable with. Show, program, podcast.
All right. Okay. Well, as you just heard, I'm here to explore the subject of the story of the woman who was caught in adultery, which appears in most Bibles in John chapter 7, verse 53 to chapter 8, verse 11. And this is a passage that has been drawn into question by various commentators, by various apologists. James White is one. Daniel Wallace, in some of his text critical lectures, you might have seen them on YouTube, also draws them into question. That is almost the default approach to this question, but often the default approach tends to involve echoing what Bruce Metzger has written about the passage. If you happen to see a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament by Bruce Metzger, sometimes you can see in a commentary written by somebody else, almost exactly the same data is presented. It's just been rephrased, recycled, and then represented. And the commentator has never really explored the question outside of what he's been told by Bruce Metzger. And when it comes to looking at the question, the footnotes in many modern translations are somewhat misleading or poorly phrased or exceptionally vague. Vague in such a way that this is the kind of way that a person would write a footnote when he wanted to guide a person to reject the passage. Now, something by pointing out that it's in the modern translations, I don't mean to necessarily dismiss all modern translations as bad. So certainly there are some good translations, but I like the translations that tend to favor the Byzantine text, which would be the King James, but that not a King James only by any stretch of the imagination. Also the New King James, the World English Bible, the WEB, the MEV. That one is relatively recent. It's based on the Textus Receptus, but when we have this term Textus Receptus, often it is presented as the text of Erasmus, or the text which is the base of the King James. But really, when you look at the King James, that is true, and yet it needs some explanation when it comes to taking the Textus Receptus as a base text.
The text. Just to cut in, the Textus Receptus, that's the text that was compiled by Desiderius Erasmus, right? Excuse me. The King James was compiled out of.
To define the TR, and I'm just going to call it TR to keep from saying Textus Receptus all the time. But the TR, one way to define it is to say the TR is any one of the textual compilations of the Greek New Testament that were presented by Protestants in the 1500s who were printing Greek New Testament. So you would start with Erasmus, but you would also include Stephanus's editions, the editions of Beza, and the last edition of Beza, or close to the last, is basically the base text of the King James. So one way to describe it, you have several editions of the TR appearing in the 1500s. Probably Stephanus's third edition would be the main one. That's the one that's reprinted the most. But also Erasmus had his first edition, second edition, third edition, and made two more. The other way to describe the TR is to say, well, that's the one that first edition that was printed that was called the TR, which would be the 1633 edition by the Elsevier printing family. And so you can say, well, the base text of the King James is the TR. But even when you look within at the details of those editions that came out in the 1500s, there are some variations. Okay. For instance, in Romans 12, verse 11, you'll find one edition that says serving the time, and one edition says serving the Lord, or other to say serving the Lord. So that's not because they were translating something. They were using the same base text. They used a different base text at that point. The compilation that they made was different at that point. Also,
okay. Well, I wasn't trying to take you off topic, but you were talking about the woman caught in adultery, right? So, and why you believe that's authentic. Okay.
But Erasmus, in one of his editions in James chapter 4 verse 2, he included a textual conjectural emendation where he put in a reading that he thought made sense, even though it wasn't in any manuscripts. And so there are little things like that tended to get sorted out as different editors made their contributions until you finally get to that 1633, where it's actually presented by the publishers as the publisher saying, "This is the Textus Receptus, the text received by all." And but the TR, even though it is on one level late because it has these minority readings, it has readings that nobody ever seen until that time in the text, in the last 6 verses of Revelation. But as a whole, the TR is Byzantine in its nature, from Matthew through Jude. If you look at that part of the New Testament, it is a Byzantine text. And even Hort, back in the 1880s, Hort being the main scholar, along with Westcott, who produced the revised text, Hort granted that the medieval text, essentially the same as the TR without the little quirks in it, was in use in the 4th century. So even though these are later manuscripts, they're not necessarily reflecting a later text, except in these little quirks that Erasmus had. These little quirks that popped up from the small textual base in those manuscripts. As a whole, they represent this very broad and really the majority of manuscripts, except in these quirky readings that sometimes appear, like in Ephesians 3 verse 9 and some other places. But when I say that, so when I say that the TR has the story of the woman caught in adultery, we see it in the King James, we see it in the Vulgate, we see it in some other places. But often when people say, well, it's supported by the TR, some people say that like it's a bad thing, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, because the TR as a whole, if people don't focus on the quirks, as a whole, the TR represents the Byzantine text, especially in the Gospels. So as a Gospel text, it is more like the Byzantine text than Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are like each other.
There will be a time for questions and answers when James is done giving his presentation too, just to let you guys know. And if I talk kind of weird, I had a tooth pulled the other day, so I just had to throw that in there. I'm all swollen up, so sorry.
So I would argue that when we see that it's in the TR, the first thing to ask is that the TR, as in, is this a quirk reading that is in the TR, a reading with very little manuscript support, or is this the TR as it is more than 80% of the time? That is this the TR as a representative of the Byzantine text, the majority text? Because if you would pick any 10 readings from Matthew through Jude in the TR, probably more than 9 times out of 10, you would have a majority text reading compared to the text of Alexandrinus. Excuse me, compared to the text of the Alexandrian text. So I'm not sure if that's if I'm conveying that clearly. Is that registering that the TR most of the time represents has the support of 85% of the Greek manuscripts? Okay, can't hear you. Just not yes or no, because I can't.
Sorry, I was muted there. I muted myself. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So unless we're dealing with a quirk reading, the TR tends to represent and tends to agree with the majority text. So when people put down manuscripts, when oftentimes the Textus Receptus is put down and say, well, the TR, but that's just late manuscripts, and Erasmus only had a few of them.
Well, yeah, I hear that a lot.
Most of Erasmus' manuscripts were Byzantine manuscripts, so most of the time when you look at the TR, you're looking at the majority reading. And this is
Actually, you
especially
know
true.
what, James?
Yeah.
I've heard that everything from the TR comes from like the 12th century or something, isn't it?
Uh,
Isn't that what they say?
well, I think the standard line would be something like I think I've heard James White or Dan Wallace say
James
that.
White, yeah. James White was
Yeah,
who I heard it from, I believe.
yeah, would say that Erasmus's manuscript. Well, the oldest one he had was no not that old. That would be manuscript 1, and even the one that he had that was the oldest, he didn't use it much because he considered its text kind of anomalous.
He said
And
they were all from like the 12th century or something.
um,
Or was it the 8th century?
I don't think he would have said 12th century, but he would have said no, reasonably late compared to what we have today from Egypt.
Yeah, and that you're saying it's not true though?
I'm saying that the if you're talking about manuscripts, a manuscript is not really important. If we were to say, well, we're going to dismiss texts because the manuscript they're in is late, well, there's no text later than this one, because this was printed like just a few years ago within our lifetimes.
Oh, yeah, but
so what matters is how old is the text of a manuscript. That's the important question. So when somebody just dismisses a manuscript because it's late, well, your printed text is even later.
Yeah, true. But
the fundamental question is how old is the text? And a Hort, who made the revised text, which is essentially the base text of modern translations, and that should be qualified, and we will qualify a little bit more soon. But essentially, the revised text is you could say lost my train of thought for a second. But to compare them, this text that we're holding, we don't reject it because of when it was printed. So why should we reject a manuscript because of when the manuscript was made? What matters is how old is the text? How far back do the readings go?
That's what I care about.
That's a much more important question. And Hort,
don't they use the manuscripts to find that out, to figure out like how far back? Like if we have a bunch of early manuscripts from I think we have them going back to the 3rd or 2nd century now, they say in the majority text.
Well, you have some majority readings that go back that far, not all, but that's just a matter of verification. But before we get to that though,
okay,
and don't forget, I'm keeping the woman on the horizon, the woman caught in adultery on the horizon here.
Yeah, that's what we want to talk about for sure. But I'll let you do your thing.
Hort himself granted that the Byzantine text, what we know today as the Byzantine text, was the dominant text of the late 4th century. So we're looking at text that's verified. No, according to Hort, in the 4th century, in the 300s. So just because the manuscripts that the TR was based on are not that old, that doesn't make the Byzantine text old. It's granted to be. I mean, even by the people that rejected almost all of it, Hort granted that the Byzantine text is a text that is verified to exist and to have been dominant in the late 300s.
Oh, really?
Now, you wouldn't really get that impression from most of the people that are arguing for the non-inclusion of John 7:53 through 8:11. And excuse me, I need to swallow.
And that's Jesus and the woman caught in adultery.
Yes. This passage is sometimes called the Pericope Adultery.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories.
I tend to call it John 7:53 through 8:11. But if you have a Bible that has footnotes, and most modern translations do, you'll probably see something like the Christian Standard Version that says it as a heading in the text. There'll be a little heading bracket that says the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811.
Let's read that story. Let's read that. Let's read a couple verses from it just to refresh people on the story. If you don't mind, or do it. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I've got the Christian Standard Version in front of me.
Okay. Yeah, whatever you want.
Then each one went to his house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, excuse me, I lost my place.
Okay.
At dawn, he went to the temple again, and all the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. Teacher, they said to him, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? They asked this to trap him, in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, "The one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. When they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. Only he was left with the women in the center.
That's
When Jesus stood up, he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she answered. "Neither do I condemn you," said Jesus. "Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore."
Yeah, that's a great story. So there's been scholars that have led people to believe that that's a later addition to the Bible, correct?
Probably most commentators today, most living commentators would have that view, and I think probably most textual critics would also have that view today.
Because they say it's not found in any earlier manuscripts. Is that why?
Well, the footnote in the CSV simply says, the heading says the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811, and that's followed up by a footnote that says other manuscripts include all or some of the passage after John 7:36, 44, 53. That's what we just read it. 21:25 or Luke 21:38. And the with that little piece of information, of course, the apologist will naturally proceed to say, well, what did Metzger think of that when he saw the passage in these different locations? But first, we should probably get an idea of what are these early manuscripts that when it says the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811, and that's really not a whole lot of it's Papyrus 66, Papyrus 75, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex A, Codex C. There's about 12 of them that are both early and major influential manuscripts. Whereas if these 12 had it, especially Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and Papyrus 75 and Papyrus 66, if these all had it, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. We would just be scratching our heads wondering why these others don't have it. But it would be accepted if it had been in these manuscripts. But that tends to focus the text on a textual line from Egypt. The earliest manuscripts are not necessarily the best manuscripts. Oftentimes those two things are put together because the reasoning is, I think Bill Mounce has made this assertion, which I think can't really be maintained when you look at the evidence. The assertion is that because a manuscript is early, we should give it precedence. We should take it more seriously simply because it's early. When you look at the actual manuscripts, the real question is, how good a job did the copyists do? Because if the copyists did a terrible job of making their copies, it doesn't matter how old it is. What matters is the quality of their work. How accurately did they preserve the text? If you look at Codex D, Codex Bezae, which is the primary Greek representative of the Western text of the Gospels and Acts, compare Codex D to your average medieval manuscript and compare those two to, say, Nestle Aland. By that standard, the medieval manuscript will come out far more accurate than Codex D.
Wow.
Codex D has been assigned to the 400s. D.C. Parker from Britain, he's put it right around 400. I would say it's later than that. But either way, it's a much older manuscript than have your pick of any medieval manuscript. Compare those two to Nestle Aland, and the medieval manuscript will come out way ahead. Compare them to Robinson Pierpont. It's back there, and it'll come out even farther ahead. So no matter which standard you're using, the date is not as important a factor as how well did the copyists do their work. Also, when you use date, you are giving the text from Egypt an inside track, so to speak. when we say what is the oldest manuscript, we say what's the manuscript that has survived the longest. And in Egypt, the climate, just the simple weather factor, comes into play, because in Egypt it is very dry.
And papyrus only lasts so long too, right? Papyrus, it only lasts so long.
Papyrus would naturally rot away where there is humidity and moisture. Papyrus will not last. That's why we don't have papyrus copies from Greece and Turkey.
And that's what they were. That's what everything was written on. And just in case there's some people that don't know that in the chat, I'm sure everybody does. But
early on, and of course, there's no way to. No, in theory, somebody could have made something on parchment, but if so, they hit it very well. So in the early days,
James,
when they were writing
it's amazing.
On parchment,
Isn't it amazing?
Copies,
Sorry,
it would be asking a lot for a papyrus copyist.
I was just going to say it's amazing how many manuscripts
it would be asking a lot for a papyrus copy from the area of Byzantium or the area of Greece or Cyprus. Greece.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Did you have? Do you have?
Can you hear me, James? Can you hear me?
I'm going to keep going.
Okay. Can you hear me?
If you have okay. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure. We had an audio issue last time. Oh no, I was just going to say it's amazing how many manuscripts actually survived.
Yes.
I was just going to say I think it's amazing how many manuscripts actually survived, seeing how the church was persecuted. Yeah. For the first couple hundred years. There's a bit of a delay. So anyway, continue.
Somewhat, although I think if you look at the first 6 centuries of Christianity, look outside of Egypt, where the weather wasn't working in favor of the manuscripts, and you don't really see a lot of manuscripts that weren't special in some way, either by being collected at a official monastery, or because they're just special in some way. They have almost like the status of a relic. But in areas outside of Egypt, the weather worked against the manuscripts. It worked in favor of the destruction just by natural force of humidity. Where there's humidity and moisture, manuscripts will decay. Whereas in Egypt, it's dry and manuscripts will naturally last longer. Even after they've been thrown away, a manuscript will last longer, as we see at Oxyrhynchus. So just because these manuscripts are earlier doesn't necessarily make them better. What makes a manuscript better is the accuracy with which its text has been copied. Lasting longer doesn't make a text improve on a manuscript. But so these manuscripts, like Papyrus 66 and Papyrus 75, they're important copies. They represent the text that was in use, but that doesn't mean that they were everything that was out there. They represent the text in one particular locale. Now Codex N is a later manuscript, and its text tends to be more Byzantine, but it's not typical of the Byzantine manuscript. Most Byzantine manuscripts include the story of the woman caught in adultery, and it might be a good point here to mention how many that is, because I think when the New King James was made in 1982, there was a footnote that kind of encouraged people to accept the story of the woman caught in adultery, because the footnote said this story, even though it's not in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, it is in 900 manuscripts. Wow. Well, they were close. The actual number is 1,500.
Wow,
so they were only off by 600 manuscripts. So 1,500 manuscripts have the story of the woman caught in adultery, whereas 270 do not have it. So that's the ratio we're looking at. It's about 85% have it, and 15% don't have it.
Wow.
Now you'll notice I don't think I've ever seen that statistic in any Bible footnote.
No, I haven't.
The Bible footnotes tend to be designed to point the reader toward the conclusion that some commentators want the reader to have.
That's true, man.
The CSB's footnote, for instance, will tell people that
you're doing this.
Other manuscripts include some of the passages after John 7:36, but they leave the reader say, wow, the manuscript seems to be moving around. It must have been this floating tradition, right? It was a floating tradition. It was flapping its wings out there like a butterfly. What wasn't that what John 7:53 through 8:11 was before it finally landed somewhere? Sometimes it landed here, sometimes it landed there, but it was clearly, obviously, some would say, James White, a floating tradition. And it's not hard though to see what has happened when you consider the evidence and why this manuscript is in these particular places. Before I get there, though, I think it might be good to give an explanation of how this passage disappeared from a certain transmission line, the Alexandrian text, and some texts that were influenced by it later on. And that is that in the early church, there were some days of the year that were more important on the calendar than other days. Just like in America, people have holidays. They have New Year's Day, April Fool's Day, Groundhog Day, and we have Christmas Day and Easter Day. But in the early church, they celebrated Easter, and that was the big day of the year.
Sorry, guys.
But also they celebrated Pentecost. We see the Christian church celebrating the Feast of Pentecost from its very beginning. There in Acts chapter 2, they're celebrating Pentecost, and it was natural to follow the example of the synagogues and assign a certain text. Oh, you okay? You okay?
Yeah, I'm okay.
They would assign specific texts, passages of Scripture to be read on certain days of the year, just like preachers often do these days. Around Christmas time, you probably won't hear a sermon from Obadiah. You'll hear something from the opening chapters of Matthew or the opening chapters of Luke. Well, on Pentecost, in the Byzantine lectionary as it stands today, the lection or the reading for the Feast of Pentecost was John 7:37 to the end of the chapter, to the end of John 7:52. But instead of finishing there, they would add chapter 8, verse 12 to it. So they would close with the words about Jesus saying, Jesus spoke to them again, I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So that was the nice ending flourish in the Pentecost lection. Now I don't mean to say that the Pentecost lection was in the Byzantine later Byzantine lection cycle was the same everywhere. Lection cycles arose independently. There were variations. They were localized. But for instance, in the Luxio lectionary in the West, it's not the same as what we see in the East. But the idea is that somebody using this as a lection, not in a fully developed lectionary, but in just a very rudimentary. This is what we usually read on this day. Here's your reading, and the idea is that these will be marked in the manuscripts. So when it comes to be that day, the lector knows when to read. A lector is a reader, and that was an office in the church or a function in the early church where one person who had a good voice would stand up and read the reading for the day. And we see this references like this in the writings of John Chrysostom in the late 300s and very early 400s. Augustine also, it looks like in his arrangement of passages, it looks like he's using some sort of election system. But it doesn't have to be a fully developed system. Just that we see here on Pentecost, this reading was the reading for Pentecost. And the idea is that in a early copy, this would be like early as in the 100s, there was a copy that's got marks in it for the lecture that just say start here and stop here. And there would be marks at some other places too where there would be reading selected. But in this particular case, there would be something else. There would be points at John 7:52 at the beginning of John 7:53. There'd be a little mark at the other side, and these marks you can see them in manuscripts that we have today by the hundreds, where it will just give a simple notification: jump down, and so the lector would jump down to where it says resume, and then at John 8 verse 12 it says resume here, and then he would go there until the end of John 8 verse 12. That's what the lector was supposed to do, and that's what those marks signified. I suppose that the lector's copy, time out. the lector's copy gets put into the hands of a copyist. The copyist is a very good copyist. He is a machine. His job is not to improve the text. His job is to just make a copy of the text in front of him and follow directions. He's a good soldier. He follows orders and does what he's told. He gets his copy, and as a professional copyist, might be familiar with the church, might be a complete stranger to the church, but he gets his copy and he says, okay, I will make a copy. So he's copying the Gospel of John. Gets to chapter 8, chapter 7, begins copying. It's the Pentecost lection. And then he gets to this part where there's this mark at John 7:52 that says, jump down. And he looks down and he says, resume here. The copyist thinks, I'm supposed to skip this passage. I'm supposed to jump down from here. I'm supposed to pick things up here. And so that is what he does. Misinterpreting the lector marks, the marks for the lector, reading the passage on Pentecost, the copyist gets a hold of this exemplar that has these instructions for the lector, and he thinks they're for him. He doesn't know that they're for the lector. So he simply takes this copy, and in the copy that he makes, the passage is gone. Now, he could be a very careful copyist, but that's why the passage is gone, because he's with a good sense of discipline and being meticulous. He does what he thinks he's supposed to do.
Yeah, I've never heard any of this before.
Copy, and just like that, the passage disappears. In the next generation, and with persecutions of various sorts, somehow this copy gets into the hands of other copyists. They use it as a master copy, and thus a line begins to have the text without John 7:53 through 8:11. That's the theory about how it disappeared. And the mechanism is not complicated. It doesn't involve having 2 or 3 different versions of the story and then being combined together. Although there is an element of that's kind of a later stage in the discussion. But that's the basic idea. It's just a simple glitch mistake, but it's a glitch mistake that had a effect upon the Alexandrian text, definitely. Partly upon the Byzantine text, we don't see the passage in the Peshitta and the Syriac translation, or the main translation in Syriac. We don't see it in Codex N. We don't see it in Codex A, although you have to use space considerations to really deduce that. But we do see it very early on in the Old Latin. Now, the Old Latin isn't Byzantine. The Old Latin is mainly Western, and in the Old Latin, most Latin copies that we have, and we have thousands of, we have more Latin copies than we have Greek copies.
Had a bit of a delay there with our audio.
But in the Old Latin, in the Old Latin, we have what are called the Old Latin chapter summaries, and in the Old Latin chapter summaries, these were kind of like the bells and whistles that some Old Latin manuscripts would have. When the Vulgate was introduced in the late 300s, there was a program to promote it. And so gradually the Vulgate replaced the Old Latin. But that doesn't mean that all the copyists were happy to have this new translation. A lot of them liked the Old Latin, and sometimes the Old Latin readings got mixed in.
So there's a Latin.
Was people saying, well, okay, I guess if we're supposed
to. You're saying there's a Latin.
The Vulgate was introduced by Jerome, and
there's 2 different kinds of Latin.
Yeah. The Old Latin version.
Oh, okay.
There's 2 different kinds of Latin versions. Yes.
Okay.
The Old Latin is the cumulative whole of, that's kind of redundant, but the Old Latin is all the Latin manuscripts that aren't Vulgate, that come from before the Vulgate. Even if an Old Latin copy is, say, medieval, its text can still echo the much earlier form of the Latin text. Probably from the time of Tertullian, or a little bit after Tertullian, the Scalitan martyrs. There's a brief narrative where it kind of mentions that there are copies of the letters of Paul, and why that's significant is that the scene that's being narrated there is from an area where Latin tended to be dominant. So it's a very strong, not really airtight, but very very likely that's a reference to Latin copies of the epistles of Paul. And if there are Latin epistles of Paul, then there are almost certainly also Latin copies of the Gospels. But the old Latin was circulating in the late 100s, 200s. We have Latin writers, and they quote from the Latin text. Guys like Augustine.
Wow, that's early.
But
That's really early.
Yeah. But Augustine's late 300s, early 400s. But the thing to see is that there's a lot of Latin copies floating around, and by the time of Jerome, people were kind of complaining that we've got all these Latin versions going around, but when you go somewhere and you want to read a text, you barely know exactly what it's going to say because so many people have made their own translations, whether they were any good at it or not. And in the 380s, Damasus at Rome endowed Jerome with the resources and the authority to say, Jerome, you're the best scholar we've got. Won't you please make us a definitive Latin version of the Bible? And Jerome was like, well, boss, you're the boss, but I know what people are going to say. Our people love their traditions, and as soon as I make a version that's different from theirs, they're going to call me some kind of twister of scripture. You know how it goes. But Jerome's Vulgate was the result in his preface to the Gospels of the Vulgate. And I don't mean that Jerome himself was responsible for every single part of the Vulgate. But he was definitely responsible for the Gospels. And the preface to the Gospels, Jerome said, I've used early Greek manuscripts as the basis for this text. I haven't revised every single little detail because the little things that we're used to, I didn't think it was beneficial or edifying to get rid of every little nuance that we're used to. But I used, as the base of it, early Greek manuscripts. So the Vulgate is a Latin text, but it has an old Greek base behind it, and at least that's the theory. Also, Jerome in his letters, one of his letters, I think to Marcella, he wrote that he had gone out of his way to prefer the ancient Greek manuscripts. So he's making this work in Latin, but he's using Greek as his main primary base text. So that's the difference between the old Latin goes before the Vulgate, and the Vulgate echoes Jerome's work. Now, in the Gospels here, but as we were saying, in the old Latin, even though the texts tend to be replaced by the Vulgate eventually, that doesn't mean that they replaced all the supplements that they had invented. Sometimes the old Latin copyists they like to introduce the Gospels with a short hypothesis or a short summary of a book. Sometimes they would have a list of strange words or names you might find in this book that you're not used to. So they would have study helps, just, kind of like what you would see in a modern day study Bible. It's just much older. And one of the things that the old Latin copyists made was not so much copyists, but producers of study Bibles, was chapter summaries. Now they weren't like our chapters; those chapter summaries that hadn't been chopped up quite that way yet. But they would take the text, arrange it into chapters, and they would summarize each chapter. And they had about 14 different ways of doing this. Well, one of those ways was quite old, and back in 1914, a scholar named Donation de Bruin. I'm probably slaughtering that, but it's Debrune. Made a book, and it's all in French, but about summaries, divisions, and rubrics of the Latin Bible. And he listed these chapter summaries, collected them all, and presented them all. One of them is assigned to either the time of Cyprian or shortly thereafter, which would be in the mid 200s or shortly thereafter. So this is an early text with that text date assignment in play. This is a very early thing that we're seeing when we look at these chapter summaries. Well, in those chapter summaries, when it summarizes this part of John, and again, the divisions are different than what we're used to, but when we see these old Latin chapter summaries, we see references to the woman caught in adultery.
And you said that goes all the way back to
Vatican,
the 3rd century?
The 200s.
Yeah, so the 3rd century.
The 200s.
Yeah, 3rd century, yeah. Wow, that's really early. That's like as early as the text is, or the Alexander Hort manuscripts and the Alexandrian manuscripts. It's pretty much as early as any of them, right?
this would be earlier than Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, about the same as, or just a tad later than P75, but old
I think
enough to
it's,
be
it's
essentially
amazing. Amazing what you're doing, James. It's really good that you're doing stuff like this. And before I met you, I thought that this was a later addition to the Bible, the woman caught in adulteress. And like I said, it's one of my favorite stories, and I think it's a lot of people's favorite stories too. So it's really great that you're doing it.
Yeah. If all I had been given was the footnotes, I'd probably think the same thing too, because the footnotes make it look like, oh, it was floating around from here to here. There was just something out there that.
I'll put a link to James's channel and his website in the description after the stream, guys, so you can check out more of what he does too.
So the old Latin chapter summaries assigned to the 3rd century, the 200s, those are early. Now, where do the old Latin chapter summaries come from? Where's the old Latin text from? When we look at the old Latin text, for instance, the text that was used by Ambrose at Milan in the late 300s. He uses some phrases that use loan words from Greek. So the old Latin, we see the Latin from Ambrose. We see behind Ambrose's text there appears to be a Greek text, and we see the old Latin as early as the 200s. So the idea of there being no contest, it's way later than the others. It's really actually so close to contest. It's like one of those affirmed allegor horse races where they're neck and neck. But when you look at the footnote and you see the reference that says all the manuscripts include some of the passage after John 7:36. Sometimes I think James White has used this reference referring to manuscript 225, and then he would ask, we see this passage moved around from place to place. What other passages do we see moved around like this?
I used to really like James White, but he's said a few things recently that I just don't really agree with me. So, I don't know how I feel about him anymore.
I kind of wish that I could have phoned in at that point to say, hey, manuscript 225, the one you're talking about, that moves the passage to John 7:36, which is that same manuscript has John 13. Part of John 13 is in John, but that's been moved too. That's over in Matthew. Why?
Yeah.
Because it's following a liturgical arrangement. Because manuscript 225 is kind of a hybrid in this respect regarding these two cases of movement. It's partly a continuous text manuscript, but it's also it's been custom adapted for the use of the lector, for the person reading the text. Adaptations have been made to make the lector's job easier. Simply put, the story of the woman caught in adultery has been moved, so the whole thing comes before the Pentecost lection. So at Pentecost, the lector doesn't have to be reading through John chapter 7 and then stop at the end of verse 52 and go find chapter 8, verse 12. Instead, it's all one continuous block.
Can I ask, are there other people? Are there other people that have found this out, or is this kind of like your theory?
This is not obscure knowledge. I think that there's a book by Tommy Wasserman. Now Wasserman would still reject the passage, but he would grant that the movement that we see has an explanation in or some of the movements that we see are explained because of the later lectionary.
And why do you think he would still reject the passage, though?
I would decline to read his mind. Possibly, he's simply not aware of the details of the case. He might be a victim of Metzgerian selectivity when it comes to the way that Bruce Metzger sometimes presents the evidence in a one-sided manner.
Like I was pretty much from listening to scholars.
A person could just add his own personal confidence to what he has read.
Yeah, I was just wondering if he had like an academic reason for it.
So to an extent, I would give some people the benefit of the doubt. To an extent, but
I was wondering if there's maybe an academic reason.
More of a witness on this, but part of the reason why there isn't, though, is because so many commentators don't do their own text critical work. They simply pick up Metzger and find ways to rephrase what Metzger said.
A lot of people like to use.
we continue
A
to
lot
look
of
at
people
the
like to
footnote.
use Bruce Metzger, don't they? Even Muslims like to use Bruce Metzger.
Perhaps, but to continue to focus on the footnote here, because I like to really fathom this footnote, and I like that term fathom. It's
Yeah.
what the guy.
Sorry, I didn't get your email till after I already made the event there, or I would have put that in there.
That's right. But to say we should fathom this footnote, and that means we're going to have to take a stick and poke it. We're going to have to take that stick into the water and find out how deep the river is. We got to fathom it. So let's poke the footnote a little bit more. The first place there in the footnote, John 7:36. Why has it been moved there? Because the manuscript has been simplified for the sake of the lector. This is so that he can have the whole passage for the day when that story is read, and then he will have all of the lection, the reading for Pentecost Day, all in one piece.
And for those of you who have just joined us, the lecture is someone who read these verses out back in the day, right? Someone with a good voice, you were saying?
The lector, that's a lector. That's the person doing the reading. And at a later point in church history, this was like an official office a person could hold. Usually, though, before that, it was just a function. They say, you got a good voice, you do the reading.
Yeah, okay.
But next in the CSB's footnote, we see a reference to John 7:44. Now, in real life, there are no Greek manuscripts that have the passage after John 7:44. Okay, wow. So if anybody is being under the impression that there are Greek manuscripts that have the story of the woman caught in adultery after John 7:44, you're being misled. This footnote, in that respect, by calling them other manuscripts, usually when footnotes refer to manuscripts, they'll say manuscripts, and when they refer to versions, they'll say versions. In this case, the manuscript is referring to versions. Is referring to manuscripts, but it's referring to non-Greek manuscripts. It's referring to Georgian manuscripts. Some Georgian manuscripts, that's in the language of Georgia, not the state of Georgia. Some manuscripts in the Georgian language have the story of the woman caught in adultery after John 7:44. Now, to explain that, I need to explain the next part first. The next part says John 7:52, and of course that's where we see it. No, that's where it usually is found. Often, though, it's found, well, not really often, but sometimes we see it after John 7:22, that is, after the end of the Gospel of John. Now, when you just see the note that says it's found after the end of the Gospel of John sometimes, it just must have fluttered in like a butterfly, floating tradition, and there it landed. But what you need to also see is the note that occurs in the leading manuscripts of the group that have it there at the end of John. Manuscript 1, one of the manuscripts that Erasmus had, and manuscript 1582. They have this note. And it's important to see this note. When you don't see the note, you can be misled. You can be under the impression of the butterfly theory. But this note says, the chapter about the adulteress in the Gospel according to John, this does not appear in most copies, nor is it commented upon by the divine fathers whose interpretations have been preserved, specifically by John Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria, nor is it taken up by Theodore of Mopsuestia and the others. Now, these were writers in the late 300s, 400s. For this reason, it was not kept in the place where it is found in the copies at the beginning of the 86th chapter, following search and see that a prophet does not arise out of Galilee. And when you look in what we know is John 7:52, that's the passage that's being quoted in this note. No,
so they're saying none of the early church fathers mentioned it either. Is that what it said?
The ones that they cherish, they're commentators, guys like John Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, Theodore of Mopsuestia do not comment upon it. And there's various reasons we could ask why. When we have, for instance, a copy of their homilies, are these simply homilies that they read on Sundays, and then somebody else later on collected them, and that's their work? Because that would possibly be one reason why it wouldn't be there, because this is for the day of Pentecost.
Yeah, I hear you.
Or rather, the story of the woman caught in adultery was for St. Pelagia's Day later on, but on Pentecost you would have Pentecost reading without it naturally. So that would account for the commentary being based on the text they were reading. So it would be a reflection of the text they were already using. But also we do see some other commentators have it. So when it refers to their cherished commentators, the divine fathers, they're not talking about Latin speakers like Pacian or Ambrose or later on Cassiodorus. They're talking about their Greek writers. But they say it was not kept in the place where it is found in a few copies at the beginning of the 86th chapter. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, I didn't know that John had 86 chapters, right? But what's the reference here is to the way that Eusebius of Caesarea divided up the text in his canon tables. In many manuscripts, the Gospels text is divided up, and there's a chart at the beginning, and there are numbers for each section. And to make a long story short, in the Gospel of John, there are various sections of the book, and the 86th section comes into play at this very point that's being referred to. Now, that has a relevance for that reference that we just had about those Georgian copies, and have it after John 7:44. The Georgian text was initially translated in the 400s based on the Armenian text, so it's kind of an echo of the Armenian text. And the early Georgian text didn't have the story of the woman caught in adultery. The early Armenian text, we can look at many Armenian copies that have the gospel, that have the story of the woman caught in adultery at the end of John. So if you have a gospel reviser in the 700s or 800s, and he's wanting to bring his old Georgian text into greater conformity with his Greek text, the Greek text that's in use when and where he is, and he comes to a Greek copy like a member of Family One would be, that has both the Greek text of the story of the woman caught in adultery at the end of John, but also this note. He sees this note that says, we have this passage, and we're working the premise that this note that he has in Greek, just like the ones that we see in Manuscript 1 and Manuscript 1582. He comes to this note and he says, we saw it at the end of, excuse me, let me lost my place here. We saw it at the beginning of the 86th chapter. Now, he would understand that to mean the 86th Eusebian section. That's what's actually being referred to. But the way that he divided up the text was, it wasn't quite the way that we would have the Eusebian canon sections divided up today. And that's why he put it at this particular spot. So that explains the old Georgian movement of the passage. But it's not actually a Greek manuscript. This is an old Georgian copy. And that's simply a side effect of the old Georgian text being revised to include what we know as John 7:53 through 8:11, but he put it at John 7:44 because he misunderstood the note. The same kind of note that we see in Family One, in Minuscule 1 and Minuscule 1582. When you see that note, you realize that it was not floating around. The note precludes it floating around because the note says specifically, we found this passage in John after the phrase, search and see that the prophet does not arise out of Galilee. Well, that's John 7:52. So whenever you have the story of the woman caught in adultery at the end of John, and you see this note, remember that the note says we put it here after taking it from earlier in John, where we have the words search and see that the prophet does not arise out of Galilee. The shorthand version of that is it went to John 7:25 from John 7:52. That's the story there. That leaves one other place where it has moved to, and that's Luke 21:38. Any questions so far? Okay. So you might say, well, why is it over here in Luke? Well, again, it's not just there in Luke in some random copies. These are all members, some closer than others, of what's called Family 13. And the Family 13 text is a text that is influenced by a lection cycle, or by the early lectionary. We see Luke 22, verse 43 through 44, in this particular cluster of manuscripts, Family 13, we see that being moved into Matthew. which is a whole other question. But we see that liturgical adaptation being made. That's what we have here. In the later lectionary system, there were two kinds of lectionary cycles, or lectionary cycles. One began on Easter, and this would be the readings that were in the Synaxarion. These were called the movable feast because they all depended on Easter. The date of Easter varied from year to year, whereas the civil year, what we would know as New Year's Day, always started on the same day of the year. So there's the Synaxarion that begins with Easter, but there's also what's called the Menologion that begins on the first day of the year. And by our calendar, that would be in January 1st. And their calendar, that would be the beginning of September. And so they had particular days of the year assigned for each day of the year. These would be things like, this is the day of the year when this great saint died. So on this day, we all come together and we honor this great saint. We remember his day. Here's a passage from Scripture that reminds us of this hero. Or here's the day that this great saint was martyred. Or here's the day that there was a really bad earthquake. Remember how we all had to get together and pull our resources and recover from it? So there was red letter days that were commemorated in the Menologion. Well, in the Menologion, they honored saints, not only the apostles and the saints that we know from Scripture, but also famous, venerable individuals throughout church history. Most of them from the time of the first 500 years of the church, but some later ones too. In fact, I think recently when some Christians were martyred in Egypt by Islamic terrorists, they were commemorated, and they had a place assigned to them in the cycle of observations. Well, there was a lady named Pelagia, and she has a great story, but I'm not going to tell it right now in the interest of time. But Pelagia had a reading assigned for her day, which was on October the 8th. Now, again, at the end, these lecture cycles weren't necessarily uniform everywhere. There were variations. Sometimes Mary of Egypt would be the saint who was honored on this day, but usually Pelagia was honored on October the 8th, and usually the reading was John 8 verses 3 through 11. And sometimes you'll see in manuscripts that have the Pentecost lection, and the Pentecost lection will be marked, but within the Pentecost lection, so that the reader does not get to John 7:52 and just keep on reading, it'll be marked with marks along the side, not the whole story of the woman caught in adultery, but just the part for Pelagia's day, John 8 3 through 11. An important distinction. Sometimes these marks are presented as if they mean, oh, the copyist or some scribe must have put marks beside this passage because he didn't think it was genuine. So you think that the copyist thought that the copyist thought that John 7:53 through 8:2 were authentic, but not verses 3 through 11? Is that your theory? Really? These are part of the lectern cycle. They represent, this is the reading for Saint Pelagia's day, and that comes and that's significant later on with another claim that's floating around among commentators and apologists. I think James White has spread that claim as well. Hopefully, we'll have time to get to it. But the thing to see is that there was this particular reading, John 8 3 through 11 for Saint Pelagia, but again, the division mark wasn't always the same. In some places, for instance, in the Palestinian Aramaic text, the reading for Saint Pelagia for that day began earlier. So you can see the whole passage.
James White's really getting there tonight, isn't he? Isn't he, James?
Well,
I'm just joking.
Try to maintain the focus on the text, but that is where we see a lot of misinformation coming from. Yeah. So I don't think anybody can.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just joking, but yeah, it's true.
I'm just saying what my eyes see.
Yeah, for sure.
So we see the story of Pelagia. That's John 8 3 through 11, but also we see the whole a bit longer, which is basically the whole passage. But we see that in Family 13 in Luke. But the reason why it's been moved, again, besides something making the lector's job easy when it comes to the day of Pentecost, is why is it there? Again, it's adapted for the ease of the lector. The lector using by this point a form of the Menologion, and it doesn't have to be the fully developed Menologion, but something like that. When it came to the saints that were commemorated on October the 7th, Sergius and Bacchus. Their reading was Luke 21, 12 through 18. So it's very natural to put this passage, if you're going to take it from the end of John and put it somewhere, the natural place to put it would be, since this is the reading for October the 8th, to put it right after the reading for October 7th. And so we see it here in Luke, reasonably close to the previous day's reading in the Minologion. And that explains that movement. So when you look at the footnote, when you fathom it, when you poke it, every single one of those movements is explained and goes back to its location at the usual place after John 7:52. So to just see the footnote, to just see the information and not appreciate or not even discern the significance of why it is moved to these particular places, that is going to guide the reader to reject the passage. Whereas in real life, if you look at this movement and look at the note in Family 1, you see that it goes that all these movements go back to saying, yeah, at some point it wasn't there in a lot of manuscripts, but also in the ones that it was never a floating tradition. The ones that have it in these different places all are just echoes that go back to having it after John 7:52. So the footnote needs to be fathomed. The footnote needs to be understood. And when you combine that with an awareness of the earliness of its attestation in the Old Latin chapter summaries from the mid-200s or late 200s, when you see that Jerome has the passage in the Vulgate, which Jerome says that he took from early Greek manuscript. Now Jerome saying this is Jerome saying this in the year 383, early to Jerome in 833, through 383. So to Jerome saying, I found this passage in early manuscripts, well, that means, how early is that? No, does that mean 4 generations? 5? How far does that go back? I would reckon pretty far. I think Jerome was probably the best scholar of his day when it came to manuscripts. So he knew what an early manuscript would look like. But also, says in another composition that he had seen the passage about the woman caught in adultery in many manuscripts, both Greek and Latin. And unfortunately, this statement of Jerome is not found in the NET. Dan Wallace, a version with which Dan Wallace is very closely associated. I think he was the New Testament editor for the NET. And in the footnote about the story of the woman caught in adultery, you don't find, I believe, in the first edition, you don't find any mention of this statement.
It was Daniel Wallace, the NTSB. Sorry.
The NET, the NET.
Okay, sorry.
And in the NET, you don't see any mention of this quotation from Jerome about finding the story of the woman caught in adultery in many manuscripts, both Greek and Latin. There's quite a bit of evidence molding in the NET. Oftentimes people just take it and say, "Oh, here's a version, a Bible version that I can access and get lots of textual information about." Well, you should be aware the evidence has been molded for you. And so that's another thing to consider when people ask, well, what do most commentators say? Are you talking about most commentators that are parrots of Bruce Metzger? Most commentators that have dabbled in the NET, or commentators that have actually dug into the manuscripts and come up with something that can be called their own work?
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we had the originals?
Wouldn't
it be nice if we just had the originals?
When you look at
that'd be nice, wouldn't it, James, if we just had the originals?
Well, you'd put some textual critics out of a job, but aside from that,
yeah, you would. Yeah, it'd be nice.
I think everybody would be nice to have the originals. Now you could also say, yeah, but if we had the originals, look what happens to the Shroud of Turin. And most people don't even think that's a real thing, and it still gets just imagine what happened. Just imagine what would happen if somebody said, "We have the original." It'd be kissed to death.
True. You're right. You're right.
So there's an upside and there's a downside to everything. Almost.
True that.
But getting back to the questions of evidence, when it comes to is this passage quoted by the early church fathers? Remember, we have that note and family one that says, well, our church fathers, the ones we like, don't use it. But you have references to guys like Pacian in Spain, who's using it. Ambrose, this is the 380s. He's using it, and he says repeatedly, he quotes from it. You have a composition that's probably Ambrose called the Apologia David, and the writer of that, if it's not Ambrose, it's somebody close to the same place at the same time, saying this passage about the woman caught in adultery is very famous. And also you have a reference being made in what's called the Apostolic Constitutions. That's a composition from about the year 380. So we're talking about compositions that are within 30 years of Codex Sinaiticus. So people always are saying Codex Sinaiticus it's the world's oldest Bible. Of course the papyri are earlier, but they're not the whole Bible. Well, all the books of the Bible, but these are what any reasonable person I think would call early writers. When you have the old Latin chapter summaries, when you have Ambrose, when you have Pacian, when you have Jerome, when you have the Apologia David, just a little bit later in the early 400s, you have Augustine. Augustine's writing in Hippo or close to Carthage in North Africa, and not only Augustine is using the story of the woman caught in adultery, but Augustine mentions that his Manichaean opponent, Faustus is also using it. Faustus is using it to make fun of
well, then
Jesus.
that should be the nail in the coffin right there. Like St. Augustine goes back to the 4th century, doesn't he? He's like in the 300s.
Well, he's born in the 300s, writes in the late 300s, early 400s. Yes.
Yeah, so that should be proof enough right there for all the scholars that say the woman caught in adultery.
Not really. Augustine's text, he's using mainly a Latin text. So the one factor to Augustine is somebody has to translate for Augustine. He's not that all entirely direct. Does Augustine know Greek? He knows some Greek, and at some point
but you said he was born in the 300s, right? That's like pretty early. Yeah, like the
not
original.
As early as you can go, though.
No, but what did they say?
When you look at the way that Hort and some others have approached the text, that Hort was willing to reject a text that he considered the dominant text of the 300s.
So the Westcott
Hort put his weight almost entirely on the earlier the echoes of the text of Egypt, and that's what's being done in a lot of translations.
So the earliest
weight is being put on the text from Egypt.
The earliest manuscripts we have go back to what? They only go back to like the 2nd century, don't they? Or do they go back to the?
Well, it's being written in the 1st century, so yeah, the earliest manuscripts we have would be from the 2nd century, but those are either one of 7 papyri or they're fragments.
Yeah, just fragments like P66.
When it comes to substantial,
yeah.
Well, there are fragments and there are fragments. See, some fragments would be
like credit card sized.
If I take a piece of papyrus and it has some New Testament text on it, and there's New Testament text on this, that's a fragment.
Yeah.
But that's nowhere close. That's nowhere close to being an entire book.
No,
that's just a fragment.
Yeah, definitely.
P66, P45, P75. These are still fragments. They're not entire pristine books, but they're much more substantial fragments. There's several.
They have like stories.
Several pages.
They have stories we can identify in them, right? Like the one when Jesus is taken before Pilate.
You can also make deductions. Do what's called a codicological analysis, and make a reconstruction of what the manuscript might have originally looked like, as far as its foliation, how it was put together, how many pages it originally had, and things like that.
We got a few new viewers in here. I'm just going to summarize real quickly. Okay. Just to summarize real quick, we got James Snapp Jr. here, you guys, and he's been talking about the authenticity of the woman caught in adulteress in John 7:53 to 8:11. I might be getting that wrong. But yeah, so maybe just give us a quick recap. So you said there's how many manuscripts actually contain this passage? Something like 1,000. Sorry.
The current count is along the lines of 1,500 have it, and 270 don't have it.
Wow.
You could probably vary that by 5 manuscripts. Some manuscripts are still being found and still being cataloged.
Yeah.
But that would give you a consistent idea of the ratio involved. 85% have it, 15% don't.
And early church fathers like St. Augustine have referenced it, you said, in their writings, right?
Not only Augustine, but also Augustine's pagan opponent, Faustus. Augustine references him having it.
Wow.
Augustine also references a group of pagans who made fun of Jesus writing in the ground, as he does only in the story of the woman caught in adultery. So they're in Augustine's locale. Not only does Augustine have it, but also his heretical opponent has it, and some other pagans also have it. So it's very clearly the dominant text there where Augustine is.
So there's a lot of evidence that this is an authentic story.
Used by Pacian of Barcelona in Spain. We see it being used by Ambrose in Milan, Italy. We see it being used by Jerome, and by this time he's retired and working in Bethlehem. But also we see it wherever Jerome saw those many Greek and Latin manuscripts. So yes, we do have 9 mainly Egyptian manuscripts that don't have it, and they're early. But Jerome says, I saw it in many Greek and Latin manuscripts. How many is many to Jerome?
Yeah.
Well, if it's more than 9, we have more early evidence for it than we have against it. But also the evidence is widespread. A person could say, well, Tertullian doesn't quote from it, Origen doesn't quote from it. Okay, granted. But also when you look at the people that do use it, Pacian, Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome, and we could list others. If you were to take a look at my book, a fresh analysis of John 7:53 through 8:11, I conclude it, or almost conclude it, with a list of the evidence, both for and against. And
I didn't know that you wrote a book on this. I'll have to put a link. Is that on your website or what?
I think I might have mentioned it on my website, but just look on Amazon for a fresh analysis of John 7:53 through 8:11.
I'll put a link in the description after to your book too.
Yeah, and it's I tried to they don't let me give it away, but it's 99 cents. But if somebody can't afford 99 cents, just throw me a line using Gmail james.snap@gmail.com and request a copy, and I'll be happy to send you a digital copy.
That's nice of you, man.
But getting back to the question of the scope of the reading, we see it being used in Spain. We see it being used in Italy. We see it being used in Egypt. We see it wherever Jerome was, and we see it wherever his manuscripts came from in Greek and Latin. So it's not as if we have not a peep out of the church by the late 300s. We have it a very broad support for it, and we also see in apostolic constitutions from the year 380.
I wonder why the push to make people think that it's a later edition. I wonder why. Yeah, it's weird.
It's because they've only heard half the story.
Yeah,
but also the apostolic constitutions is based on an earlier work. Sometimes we have earlier works that were combined into later works, and in the apostolic constitutions, that kind of echoes to an extent. At this point, the Syriac didascalia, and that's estimated to be in the first half of the 200s. Now, if I may, here's a significant chapter from the didascalia. This is from the old Latin chapter summaries that mention the adulteress in John are assigned to shortly after the time of Cyprian. This is from the time of Cyprian, or a bit earlier, from the Didascalia chapter 7. And some editions of the Didascalia, this would be chapter 6. But it's after the discussion on the prayer of Manasseh. But it says, for if you receive not him who repents, because you are merciless, you sin against the Lord God, because you do not obey our Lord and God in acting as he acted. For even he, to that woman who had sinned, her whom the elders placed before him, and left it to judgment in his hands, and went away. He then, who searched the hearts, asked her and said to her, have the elders condemned thee, my daughter? She said to him, no, Lord. And our Savior said, go and return no more to do this, neither do I condemn thee. In this, therefore, let our Savior and King and God be to you a sign, O bishops. Now, that's what somebody is saying in the early 200s. So, and yet, if you read Metzger, you would not get this impression. You would not see that scope of support. And if you only watch Dan Wallace's presentations, you would not see that support, because he says, the early patristic writers don't say anything about it. Well, we just read from, or we just referenced Pacian, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, Apostolic Constitutions, Syriac Didascalia.
Wow. And how can he say that?
As far as I know, Dan Wallace is that. Well, the question is, how can he go on saying that? Anybody can make a mistake. Anybody can just overlook something.
Exactly. Yeah.
But to go on spreading this statement, which he has to know, is
there must
true.
be a monetary incentive.
That's the question, because people will take Dan Wallace's word for it, and they'll say, "Well, I have it on the authority of Dan Wallace that no patristic writers quote this passage," and they'll take that to the congregations and they'll tell them. And every time it gets told, often well, not every time, obviously, but frequently when it gets retold, a little bit more will get added to it, and a little bit more will get added to it. The snowball rises, and pretty soon, no patristic writers know this passage. It shouldn't be in the Bible.
Yeah, it's too bad.
That's
because
how it happens.
Such a beautiful story too. It's like such an amazing story. It's really too bad that they centered in on that one. But it's awesome what you're doing. So you're combating this.
On the question of older manuscripts, in manuscript 135, and this is a manuscript from the 900s, this note is found in manuscript 135, manuscript 301. I believe it's also in 1006 and 1078. I haven't been able to personally check every single one of these. But the note says, this also, and this is a reference to the story of the woman caught in adultery, was discovered in ancient copies. So we felt obligated to write at the end of his gospel what follows here. And that's kind of a condensed note, like what we see in Family One. And you can see in other ways that these texts from these manuscripts are connected. In manuscript 34 from the 900s or 1000s, says there's a note that says, it's been determined that the passage with asterisk alongside it about the adulteress is not present in a great number of, or most of, the copies. Yet it is found in the old ones.
What? That's crazy.
Manuscript 565. Now this is one that's like Family One. This is a manuscript like Family One, and it has basically a version of the same note. The chapter about the adulteress in the Gospel of John not being present in the current copies was omitted. It was located right after does not arise. So again, we see the same thing we see in manuscript 1. In manuscript 1282, we see a note where in manuscript 1282 we see asterisk, and you think, well, the asterisk or the abali, mean the scribe didn't think it was original, right? Well, when you look in details, check which verses it's beside. Is it beside? Are the abali beside the whole passage? No, they are not. They're beside chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. It's important to make that distinction, Dan Wallace. Yeah. When you see that the abali are just beside chapter 8, verse 3 through 11, you realize they're not saying throughout this passage, they're saying, here's the passage not to read on Pentecost because it's been designated as the reading for St. Pelagia's Day.
Not only that, this story has
1484, there's another note. Now, in 1484, this is...
Sorry, this story has a lot of cultural influence. It's a good story morally, you know what I mean? It's not only a good story, but it's a good moral lesson. So when you tell people that it's inauthentic or not valid, it kind of throws out the whole teaching.
It is, and I think that's... Well, I think that some folks, back in 2014, there was a symposium on the passage. And even the scholars that went to that symposium and held that it was not original still said it should be preached.
Yeah, so exactly.
You can take that for what it's worth.
Yeah,
but in manuscript 1424, it's not in the text, but it is written in the margin. And after it's been written in the margin, there's this note. This is not in some copies, nor in those copies of Apollinarius. In the ancient copies, it is all present. And this pericope was recollected by the apostles, which affirms that it is for the edification of the church. Now, last reference there where it says it was recollected by the apostles, the note writer is referring to Apostolic Constitutions, Book 2, Section 24. So we see in the person that made that note in 1424 considered 2 points. First, he said, hey, this was cited back in Apostolic Constitutions, which he appears to think is authentic. But also he says, in the ancient copies, it is all present. So we see that this question was discussed in the churches, but we also see that it's in 1,500 copies, and we see it being repeatedly affirmed as being in the old copies in these notes. I'm not sure, without an official church council, of how much more plainly the writers of these notes could say this has been accepted by the church.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds pretty plain to me too.
And with that, I think I'm happy to take any questions that anybody would have.
Okay, if anybody has any questions for James, now's the time. Just type them in the chat. And yeah, it's not very many people watching, but maybe if somebody has a few questions before he gets going. Thanks for coming very much. This was amazing. Thank you for putting this out. There'll be more people that watch it. Usually get a few thousand views per video once it uploads and processes and stuff, right? So anybody have any questions for James or anything?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're watching this after if you're watching this after it was initially made, I'll try to keep an eye on the comments and respond to comments as they appear. That doesn't mean I'll be able to respond indefinitely, but I'll make an effort to engage.
I think there's might be some quotes in here I can read from a few people.
Okay, well, Nick, do you have any questions? I think I've covered every aspect of the footnote. So, footnote, consider yourself fathomed.
Not really, man. That was a pretty good presentation. I just want to say thanks for coming on here. And anytime you want to come back and talk about some more stuff, you're more than welcome. I thought I had a couple. Jeremiah 33, verse 16. Someone brought up. They just put that out there.
Some folks might wonder about Mark chapter 16.
I haven't got.
That's probably a reference to what in some traditions and some Latin traditions of what Jesus wrote down in the sand.
Gia has a question.
There's another tradition that says that's the gist of that was what was written in the sand.
Gia would like to know what drew you into this.
Just an interest in the text. I think I recall back well, it was a ways back in high school. I happened to be at a book sale. My sister was a student at Taylor University here in Indiana, and she had invited me over to Taylor for a day. And the library there, it's a nice library. They were having a book sale, and I acquired a copy of Cursop Lake's, not the first edition, but an edition of Cursop Lake's The Text of the New Testament. That kind of provoked a greater exploration of the subject of manuscripts.
Nice. So you've been doing this for a while then.
So if anybody's interested also in the subject of another major textual variant, Mark 16, 9 through 20, I'd be happy to come back on and maybe we could talk about that. Because that's another passage where there are some very misleading footnotes. There are some commentaries that are actually wrong about some of the manuscripts. There's probably more misinformation being spread about these two passages, Mark 7, 53 through 11, and Mark 16, 9 through 20. There's probably more misinformation that has been spread about these manuscripts than about any other 24 verses in the entire New Testament, as far as the textual basis is concerned.
That sounds great. I'll definitely have you back on and we can talk about that other passage then. How about that?
So, all right. Well, Nick, I think that we've probably covered every question that we can. So,
okay, cool, man.
Close with prayer.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Sure, why don't you close for a prayer then? Why don't you lead us in a prayer?
Okay. You want to close the prayer?
Go ahead. Why don't you do it? You do the honors.
Okay, let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, you make all the creatures of the sea, the wild animals of the earth, look to you for their food. And Father, we just ask that you would likewise open your hand to us, so we can receive your word and be nourished and be benefited, that we may be blessed to be blessings to others. Help us to be the hands and feet of your Son Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. That was awesome. Again, thank you for coming on. I definitely would love to have you come back and talk about Mark sometime. So thank you very much. And I will put links to your website and your channel in my description, okay?
Okay, and I may have mispronounced things in there here and there. If anybody needs any clarification, I'll try to keep up to date on the comments.
Cool, man. Thanks a lot, buddy. Thanks for coming on. I'll make a time for you to come back sometime, okay? Whenever you want. Thanks a lot. Okay, guys, thanks for watching. This was James Snapp Jr. I'll be putting links in my channel to his website and to his YouTube channel, and we're going to have him come back on in a couple weeks to talk about Mark.
Okay. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. See you, James. Okay, that was cool, guys. Thanks for coming. We didn't have as many people as last time, but that's okay. We got a King James only debate coming up here. And what's going on? Oh, we got a flat earther coming to talk about his beliefs. JM Truth. He believes in the Bible, but he's also going to come talk about flat earth. So that will be interesting. Hey, guys. So make sure you guys keep a lookout on the community board for live shows coming up. And thanks for watching, guys. We will see you next time.